podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. When you're ready to launch your next app or want to try a project you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out Linode. With 200 gigabit private networking, scalable shared block storage, node balancers, and a 40 gigabit public network, all controlled by a brand new API, you've got everything you need to scale. Go to podcastinit.com/Linode today to get a $20 credit and launch a new server in under a minute. And visit the site at podcastinit.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the newsletter, read the show notes, and get in touch. And go to podcastinit.com/chat to join the community and keep the conversation going. Your host as usual is Tobias Macey, and today I'm interviewing Kovid Goyal about Calibre, the powerful and free ebook management tool. So Kovid, could you start by introducing yourself?
Hi Tobias, thanks for having me. My name is Kovid Goyal, and I'm the creator of Calibre. I've been working on Calibre for almost 12 years. It started out as a simple way to use ebook devices on Linux. That's my operating system of choice. But since then, it has morphed into, I think, the most popular and widely used ebook management solution out there.
And do you remember how you first got introduced to Python?
Let's see. I think there were two things that introduced me to Python. One was a fun one. I used to use the KDE desktop, and this is way back 15 years ago, and there was something called Super Caramba that we used to draw fun little widgets on the desktop, and these were programmed using Python. I think that was my first introduction to Python. Also, at the time, I was a grad student at Caltech, and to do some of my numerical work in quantum computing simulations, I used to use Python. Those were the two things that introduced me to Python, and when it came time to work on Calibre, it was sort of the natural choice.
And so can you give a bit of a description about what Calibre is and how the project first got started?
All right. Ebook readers are sort of dedicated devices that are used for reading books. And in 2006, Sony released the first ebook reader. I think it was called the PRS 500 in the United States. And I was a grad student at the time. And I'm a bookworm, so I used to read a lot. I used to actually have a handheld GPS called the MyTac Neo, and I had sort of hacked it to be able to read simple text files on it. So naturally, when a dedicated device to do this was released, I was all over it, and I went and purchased it the first day. Sadly, when I got it home, I realized that it did not work with Linux. It used a proprietary USB protocol, and it required Sony software, which was available only for Windows and Mac. Being a grad student, having a bit of time in my hands, I decided to reverse engineer it. And there was this community of ebook enthusiasts called mobileread.com. We got together, and some of them helped me reverse engineer the protocol. And I wrote something called libprs 500, which basically had the ability to, one, talk to the device running on any operating system, and two, to convert ebook files to the format that Sony used for its devices, for something called LRF, which was a crazy binary format that would die in a fire. So that was how Calibre started. So the PRS 500 initially was just a hobby project that I released to the world in the hopes that it would be useful to people, and it turned out to be quite popular. So eventually, in a couple of years, I sort of renamed it to Calibre and made it work with a whole bunch of different reading devices from different companies and support a whole bunch of ebook formats. It's been growing ever since.
So when you first started working on it with the Sony ebook reader, the landscape of devices for being able to do dedicated e-reading was still fairly small, but over the intervening years, there have been a large number of new e-readers and tablets and phones and other types of devices that people might want to load their ebooks onto. So I'm wondering how you're able to keep up to date with all of the different devices and being able to support interfacing with them in terms of the wire protocols and being able to load and retrieve the file formats from those devices, particularly given the rate of change within that product category.
The key to doing this is that Calibre itself has excellent built-in introspection capabilities. We can plug in an unknown device and run a command which will output a whole bunch of information about the device and how the device works. So that allows me to support a lot of devices without actually having access to those devices, just from that introspection information. The other thing is that while it's true that to start with, there were a whole bunch of devices that were all very different, nowadays things are more or less settled down. There are basically two large families of devices, the Kindles from Amazon and the Kobo devices from Kobo. the rest are usually smartphones, tablets, those kind of things that are general purpose devices. And those have speaks of standardized protocols like MTP, mass storage protocols. So most of the device protocol development work in Calibre is now more or less done. It's pretty stable. Calibre can connect your device over a wire, wirelessly, using a web browser, whatever you like. As for another sort of big thing that helps me keep Calibre supporting new devices is that you have a very active and helpful user community. And so people who get access to a new device will typically run the introspection capabilities and send me the information very promptly, so I can then release support for the device in a day or two. So just last week, Amazon released a Kindle Paperwhite 2018, and so within a day of its being released, I'd received a bug report with the debug information. And a couple of days later, I made a new Calibre release supporting the device, although I don't have the device myself. And when it comes to ebook formats, there are now basically two major ebook formats left. There's EPUB, which is something of a standard. And there's the Kindle family of formats, which actually now has 4 or 5 different incompatible formats, but Amazon keeps producing new ones every few years. So those are the two major formats that people like to convert ebooks to. There is, of course, a large number of formats that people like to convert from. For example, convert from Office documents, docx files, LibreOffice ODT files, RTF files, text files, PDF files, and various older ebook formats such as FB2, movie, so on. The list is endless. I think if you look at the Calibre manual, you'll see there are some 20 odd formats. Yeah, so the design of Calibre that enables it to do all this is that it's basically the conversion is a pipeline. So there are input plugins at one end, and there's common core in the middle, and there's output plugins at the other end. So the input plugins all convert books, whatever the initial format, into an HTML-based sort of internal format. Conversion pipeline then works on that internal format to do all the various features that Calibre conversion supports, and then the output plugins take that HTML-based format and convert it to whatever the output format is. This design was made very early in Calibre's history, back when I didn't really know what I was doing, but nonetheless, it's been pretty good for us, and it's stayed largely unchanged in the overall design for over a decade, which speaks well of its initial construction.
And as you mentioned, Calibre has a large community. It's been around for a long time. So I'm curious if you can discuss some of the main features of Calibre and the ones that you have gotten the most feedback about that people find useful for their own particular use cases.
So the main features of Calibre are ebook conversion, obviously, getting books from one format to another, interfacing with ebook devices, managing the collection of books on your devices. So Calibre will automatically convert books to the optimal format for a device when you plug it in and send the books to that device. Another feature that's very widely used and actually has the most active set of third-party contributors is the recipe system. So Calibre has a system whereby you can write small Python scripts that are called recipes that allow Calibre to scrape websites and convert them into ebooks, typically used for publicly accessible news websites. So, for example, the New York Times, The Economist, Wall Street Journal, so on. There are literally thousands of recipes in Calibre. Most of these recipes have been contributed by users, and since websites formats keep changing, this whole area of Calibre is probably the most actively developed because it requires endless updates to recipes as website formats change. So the nice thing about the system is that you can sort of schedule Calibre to download your news every morning and set it to your device, email it to you, whatever you like. And that's pretty widely used. I mean, it has millions of users, just that feature alone. And what else? Calibre has content server, so you can expose your Calibre library over the internet. You can access it using a web browser. You can add books, you can convert, you can edit metadata. All the major features of the book can be accessed via the content server. In fact, the content server is relatively recently was redesigned for Calibre 3 and rewritten using RapidScript, which is a sort of Python-like language I worked on for Calibre that allows me to write Python in the browser, basically. And so the content server is still being worked on. So it has a integrated ebook viewer in it, so you can read books in a browser without needing any specialized software on your phone. And well, let's see what other major features. It has an editor, which was a big addition. So originally there was this program called Sigil, which people used to use to edit EPUB format books, and that at one point its maintainer stepped down, and for a while it looked like no one was willing to take over. So I decided to implement an editor in Calibre itself, and the editor grew to be able to edit EPUB as well as AZW3, which is the Kindle format closest to EPUB. You can use the editor to edit books. It has live as you type preview. Allows you various tools to do things like embed fonts, spell check, grammar check, so on and so forth. So yeah, these are I think some of the highlights of Calibre's features.
And in addition to all of the built-in capabilities for the core project, there is also a plugin ecosystem that has continued to grow. So I'm wondering, one, how it's implemented as far as being able to extend the project and some of the different integration points, and then also some of the most interesting and most popular plugins that have been created for Calibre.
Right. So the internal design of Calibre is highly motivated by the principle of modularity. So Calibre itself is implemented using plugins. There are a whole bunch of built-in plugins. If you start Calibre and you go to preferences and plugins, you'll see that there are literally hundreds of built-in plugins. Everything is a plugin. Conversion is input and output formats are plugins. Metadata download, each individual source of metadata has a plugin. The viewer has plugins. Each individual ebook device is a plugin, so on and so forth. So the design of Calibre is highly plugin based internally anyway. So adding support for third-party plugins is really easy. You just it's really easy to create a Calibre plugin. You create a zip file with a few Python files inside. Follow the Calibre plugin API, and you can basically do anything you want in a Calibre plugin. There are no restrictions. The plugin is run in an environment that has full access to the Calibre program, all its capabilities, all its state, everything. So this is, of course, dangerous in something like a browser where people can't always trust plugins. But Calibre is that way, much smaller, and has a more friendly community. So far there has been plugin malware. So yeah, the plugins are sort of all there are different types of plugins for different parts of Calibre. For parts that work with the database, parts that work with the conversion, parts that work with devices, and so on. So if you wish to write a Calibre plugin, you just need to read up on the API of that particular part of Calibre and write your plugin. So coming to popular plugins, interesting plugins, there are plugins to, for example, download metadata. For example, there's a Goodreads plugin that's very popular. Downloads metadata from the Goodreads website. There are plugins to things like convert Wikipedia pages to ebooks. You can just put in a Wikipedia URL and it will go and download that particular page and make it into an ebook. This sort of leverages the recipe system I was talking about earlier. There are plugins to do things like count pages in ebooks. Put them into your library so you can have an indication of what size your books are. There are plugins that deal with things that Calibre doesn't do out of the box. For example, comics. There are Calibre does not write metadata to comic files, the CBC and CBR files, because there isn't really a good standard for it. So but there's a plugin that works popularly supported formats for it. There are plugins to do things like, one very popular plugin is the fan fiction plugin, which allows people to download fan fiction from various websites and convert it into books in a Calibre library seamlessly and get updated automatically when the stories are updated. There are plugins that improve Calibre's integration with particular devices. For instance, there are plugins that do lots of things with Kobo devices, auto-convert books to the Kobo-specific EPUB format, which has certain nice properties compared to the EPUB format on Kobo devices. There are plugins that deal with managing collections on the Kindle. This requires rooting the Kindle, so it's not part of Calibre itself. there are plugins that allow you to manage a Calibre interface. So there's something called a view manager plugin that allows you to specify sort of views of a Calibre library containing different subsets of books, devices, and so on. So that's quite popular as well. So yeah, I mean, there are literally hundreds of plugins. There are plugins to automate ebook cleanup tasks. Like lots of ebook publishers don't do very well with formatting and coding in many ebooks is atrocious. So there are plugins to automate cleaning up some of that. There are plugins to check the quality of books in your library, flag commonly found mistakes and autocorrect them, that kind of thing. Yeah, that's a good summary, I think.
And you mentioned that the entire architecture of Calibre is now highly plugin based, where each of the different core features are themselves plugins to the core engine. So I'm wondering if you can discuss a bit further how the overall project is architected and how that has changed over the years that you've been building and maintaining it.
So the overall structure of Calibre is highly modular. It's sort of inspired by the principle of each part of Calibre should focus on one thing and should export a well-defined interface that the rest of Calibre can use to do that one thing. So, for example, I talked about the conversion pipeline a little while earlier. So there are input plugins and there's a common area, the core conversion engine, and then there are output plugins. Similarly, in the device subsystem, there are sort of there's a core engine that has all the common logic for talking to devices, sending books to them, updating metadata, and so on. And there are plugins for individual devices that override little bits or supply little bits of functionality that the core cannot have because it's device specific. So this basic architecture was baked into Calibre pretty early on, so it hasn't changed much. It's served us well, and it shows every sign of continuing to serve us well. So, for example, the recipe system for downloading news into ebooks, each recipe is basically a plugin. And there are a whole bunch of built-in ones, and users, not just programmers, but users can easily create recipes of their own liking, provided they have RSS feeds. So, yeah, so every part of Calibre is basically architected in a modular fashion. There is a core engine that tries to keep all the basic and common and difficult logic within it. And then there are plugins that provide bits of functionality that core engine sort of needs that are specific to whatever the task at hand is. So it's almost as if the core engine is sort of a central command, and each plugin is a sort of worker or processor that does specific tasks at the direction of the central command. So yeah, the architecture of Calibre is in some sense a central command and control with a whole bunch of sort of worker processes. They're not actually processes, but you can think of them as processes that do various device specific, format specific tasks. So yeah, that's the basic architecture. The biggest sort of evolution in Calibre has been basically fixing mistakes I made because I was a much worse programmer 12 years ago. So various subsystems of Calibre have been rewritten over time. So for example, Calibre 1.0 was a rewrite of the library database backend, and that provided an almost an order of magnitude speed up. But the nice thing that made it possible to do was that the library, the database part of it was again behind a well-defined API. So I could keep that API in place more or less and just rewrite the internals so it wouldn't affect the rest of Calibre. So yeah, I mean, most of Calibre's modern development has been either rewriting old parts of Calibre or adding new features within this overarching framework of a central command with plugins that provide specific implementations.
And one of the main ways that people interact with Calibre is via the GUI, which isn't always the strongest piece for Python and its ecosystem. So I'm wondering what you're using for building the graphical interface and any sorts of challenges or issues that you've had to overcome in the process of maintaining Calibre, particularly as GUI libraries have come and gone in the ecosystem.
So I was fortunate in that I chose Qt, Qt and PyQt as the libraries to use right at the beginning. This was because, if you recall, I told you about KDE, and KDE was and is based on Qt. So I chose that as right at the beginning, and that's been pretty stable. I mean, it's been around for the entire history of Calibre. And so Calibre's main GUI is written using Qt. And the biggest challenge really with the GUI has been, so initially in the early years, I used to try to give Calibre a platform-specific look and feel. It would look and behave slightly different on Macs, on Windows, on Linux. But over time, I realized that this is sort of a losing battle, because what happens is that you sort of end up in an uncanny valley where things are somewhat similar, but not quite similar to native programs. Programs are using whatever the default toolkit for that platform is. So you sort of have people who who complain that things don't behave the way they should, or they do in other programs. And at the same time, you're sort of restricted because things work differently in different platforms, and so it's harder to do support. It's harder to develop new features because each feature has to be tested in each platform. So I at some point I changed that over to sort of having a unified look and feel by default on all platforms. So Calibre looks the same regardless of whether you're running on Windows, Macs, or Linux. I mean, more or less the same. It's things like font rendering and so on, still platform specific. So that was a big simplification and a big, I think, positive thing in Calibre's history. I still get people complaining about Calibre not being a native looking program, but on the other hand, there are lots of people who like the fact that it has consistent look and feel across platforms. So the GUI part of Calibre has not been a pain point. It's been pretty smooth sailing, touch wood.
And I imagine that the choice of Qt as the language for implementing the UI has also helped in terms of the packaging of the project, because that's another area that has been fairly difficult to deal with in the Python ecosystem for a while, particularly given the number of platforms that you're supporting.
Right. So packaging Python programs is a huge pain. So I ended up writing an entire project of tens of thousands of lines to package Calibre. It's there in my GitHub. It's called build-calibre. So it basically allows you to issue a single command and build Calibre for all its platforms. It builds them in sort of chroot jails on Linux, and it builds them in VMs for Windows and Macs, and it takes care of all the collection of dependencies, the packaging of the various libraries that are not widely available, the slimming down of Python for embedding into an application, all that sort of stuff. So I mean, that was a huge thing that has evolved over 10 years, 10, 12 years, that I have sort of had to maintain personally, because none of the available out-of-the-box solutions for Python packaging are anywhere near where they need to be to work this out for something at the scale of Calibre. So I actually reuse this infrastructure for Kitty as well. Kitty is only available on Linux and Macs, but the same infrastructure is used to build it for those two platforms. So essentially, this is my personal Python build infrastructure that I intend to use for all my Python projects going forward, and it's written in Python.
And as you mentioned, the time span that you've been working on Calibre, I'm wondering what has continued to motivate you to keep working on it, and how sustainable the project is overall, given the amount of time that must be required to keep up to date with the regular release cycle and the improvements and evolution of the project over the years.
So one of the lucky things where I lucked out was my choice of Python. So Python has an extremely high development velocity. So I can deliver features, bug fixes, etc., with much less effort than using most other languages. Of course, I could be biased by my large familiarity with Python, but I strongly feel that this is one of the things that led to Calibre's success. As for my own personal motivation, I mean, I've been working full-time on Calibre for, I think, 8-9 years now. So I actually make enough money from donations and other sources of income that I can afford to work full-time on Calibre. It's been pretty sustainable so far. I've been doing it for almost a decade. And technically it stays interesting enough because Calibre is large enough and has a wide enough set of things that it covers that there are always new things that I have to learn to implement new features. So I mean, I've done things as diverse as rendering graphics primitives in the PDF format, to writing a new browser-based language to reverse engineering USB protocol, dealing with various networking issues, SSL issues, writing code to deal with all sorts of binary file formats. So, I mean, the thing is diverse enough and challenging enough that I don't feel bored working on it. And from time to time, I do different things. Like I contribute to another project called Kitty, which is a terminal emulator also. These types of yeah, I've been pretty consistently motivated to work on Calibre for a very long time now. So as long as the income stream remains the way it has been, I think Calibre is pretty stable. Of course, there are no guarantees, but yeah, it's pretty sustainable. It has a big community, lots of developers who are familiar with code base, not as familiar as me, but familiar enough that if I was run over by a bus, somebody would probably keep it going if needed.
It's always great to hear when a project is successful enough to allow the primary developer to dedicate their full attention to it. So it's great that you have continued to receive enough support to make that a viable option. And another thing that I'm curious about is, as we mentioned, the evolution of devices that Calibre is interfacing with. I'm curious how that has also evolved in terms of the use cases and feature sets that people are looking for within Calibre as their needs change or as their particular usages change in terms of the way that they're consuming and creating and obtaining material for reading on their devices.
Mm-hmm. So Calibre is mostly for bibliophiles, people who like to read long-form literature, not necessarily literature, but long-form text. So that basic use case is pretty much constant. You'd only be interested in Calibre if you are the kind of person who likes to read long-form text and likes to maintain his or her own collection of such text. So fortunately, there are millions of people in the world who fall in that category. So Calibre has a reasonably large pool of users. So the biggest change in Calibre's history has been the rise of the smartphone and the tablets. So to start with, Calibre worked only with dedicated devices, the Sony readers, Kindles, Kobo. But nowadays, a lot of people use it with a smartphone or a tablet, and so a big change that had to be done in Calibre was to add the content server, which allows you to access your collection using a browser, read it, manage it, etc. So that was a big demand from people who use smartphones and tablets, because just plugging, you don't typically plug those into your computer using USB cables, transfer stuff. So having a network way of accessing Calibre was a must, and I think that we have addressed that pretty comprehensively now. So that was, I think, one of the biggest evolutions that Calibre itself had to go through over the years as people's usage patterns have changed.
And in addition to the fact that the project has been around for a long time, over that period, it has also, as you mentioned, become sort of the de facto standard for ebook management and library management. So I'm curious what you see as being the reason that it has gained that level of popularity and maintained it, and what some of the other competing options are for somebody who's looking for a way to manage their collection of ebooks and digital texts.
So I think the biggest single factor in Calibre's success was simply timing. It existed before anything else did in a much better form. So I told you about how I started working on Calibre when Sony first released its ebook reader. So Sony had a companion software for its reader that only worked on Linux and Macs, and it was pretty bad. And then Adobe released the Adobe Digital Editions, which was also pretty bad. So essentially, Calibre sort of cornered the market early, and once it gained that momentum and never lost it. And the secret to not losing it is being responsive to your users, fixing bug reports promptly, responding to queries promptly, continually evolving the product. So one of the biggest forms of positive feedback that I get from Calibre users is how happy they are that Calibre has a regular release cycle, is always innovating, always adding new things, always fixing bugs, becoming a smoother, faster, more streamlined, more efficient, nicer experience over time. People really appreciate that sense of evolution. The other thing that I've been really careful about is to not make changes just for the sake of change. So the Calibre UI, if you compare it from 8 years ago and now, is not significantly different. There are no startling new UI paradigms. It still looks more or less the same. I mean, it's smoother, it's more polished, etc., etc. But there are I very rarely break user-facing things if I can help it at all. So I think Calibre users, so that kind of thing, the stability married to the constant improvements and progress engenders a lot of loyalty in Calibre's user base. So I actually have some statistics there about people who donate to Calibre, and a very large fraction of them actually donate more than once, which, at least in my experience, is very unusual. So the most important thing was the timing, the fact that Calibre existed when nothing else did and was much better than whatever existed at the time. The other big thing is that the main competitors of Calibre in this space have been companies that want to sell ebook devices or create an ecosystem of of their own. For example, Apple with iBooks, and because so Calibre's only focus is to be the best ebook manager it can for its users, whereas its competitors' focuses have often been to lock people into an ecosystem or to sell more devices or to promote their ebook format, or things that are not directly in the user's interests. And so the fact that Calibre aligns well with its users' goals, I think, has helped it stay ahead of the competition.
In addition to the devices and platforms that you're supporting and the multiple formats, there is a significant amount of complexity involved in being able to convert between them and support the different book formats on the different platforms. So I'm curious what you have found to be some of the most challenging or complex aspects of being able to interoperate between the various book formats and being able to convert between them, and any sorts of issues that you've encountered in terms of loss of fidelity or loss of information as part of the conversion process.
So the biggest challenge with dealing with ebook formats is proprietary formats. So Amazon, for example, has a bunch of proprietary formats that all have to be reverse engineered. And so, when you're reverse engineering a binary format, you can never be 100% sure of how it's intended to work. And then there is no spec that you can code against. You just have to see what Amazon software does in certain different situations and sort of try to replicate that behavior in your own software. And it's a moving target because Amazon happily changes things and breaks things feel like it. So this is the single biggest challenge. I mean, reverse engineering proprietary formats is the single biggest challenge with dealing with ebook formats. The other sort of challenge is when different formats have different semantic information. So trivial but very often encountered problem is that, say, the PDF format has no concept of book covers. You typically just take the first page of the PDF and assume it's a cover. But say when you're doing something like updating metadata in a PDF and you want to change the cover, you can't sort of replace the first page because there's no way to be sure that it's a cover. So you just have to add in a page, and if you do that repeatedly, then you end up with multiple covers. So the format has no concept of a cover. So there's no way to sort of reliably detect when a PDF first page is a cover or not. So similarly, when you convert between Office formats like DocX to an ebook format, there are a whole bunch of semantics of HTML and CSS, which is what ebooks are based on, that don't match the formatting and display semantics of Office formats. So you can actually convert from DocX and to DocX. So if you do a round trip, there is a whole bunch of the resulting DocX that you get will look very similar to the original DocX visually, but internally there'll be a whole bunch of semantic information that will be lost in that process. So it's this kind of mismatch between the capabilities and semantics of formats that is the second biggest challenge in converting between formats. And I guess the other thing is just simply finding the time to do this, because you can cover the 90% use case with 10% of the effort, but getting all the corner cases right and getting all the weird interactions between things in obscure formats right is painful and takes a lot of time. So a big help with doing that is having an active and helpful user community who will make meaningful bug reports and attach test cases and try to reduce things and simplify things. So that makes the work of the developers actually doing the work much easier. So Calibre has been fortunate in that its user community is pretty good. People are helpful, people are polite, people are try to do as much work as they can themselves instead of just expecting us to do everything for them. So it works out pretty well in the end.
And Another aspect of being able to obtain and manage a private library of electronic books is the prevalence of, as you mentioned, proprietary formats and DRM restricted content that is available through major publishers and retailers. So I'm wondering what your thoughts and experiences are on the current state of digital book marketplaces and the availability of unencumbered formats and unencumbered books that people can obtain for being able to read on their own.
As far as formats are concerned, you are best off looking for EPUB. That's the most open and the most documented and the most widely supported format. And when it comes to DRM, different publishers, different retailers, different vendors have different DRM policies. Some of them DRM all their books, some of them DRM books at the author's or publisher's request. So you should look for sources that are DRM free if at all possible, and prefer those to build your collection. But if you can't, personally, I feel that if you've bought a book, it's perfectly ethical. I don't know if it's legal, but it's perfectly ethical to remove the DRM from the book. So there are plenty of tools available to do that. Fortunately, none of the DRM systems of the major ebook retailers are unbroken. Yeah, so I mean, if you want to build a collection, you pretty much in the end have to deal with DRM either by boycotting publishers who publish DRM books or removing the DRM. You can't really build a collection that contains only DRM. The work is highly fragile. Yeah, so the ideal workflow for somebody who is building a collection using Calibre would be to buy the books, remove the DRM, and add the book to the Calibre library so that it's there present for them for all time. And I think that it's a real shame that DRM exists because it doesn't work, as is evidenced by the ease of removing it. It only inconveniences people who want to do things the legal way, and it makes the entire sort of book ecosystem much more fragile. So tomorrow, if say some major vendor of books was to disappear, their entire collection of DRM works would become inaccessible. This has happened several times in the past, so it's not a theoretical scenario. So if instead people were encouraged and allowed to maintain their own collections, things would be much more robust. Any individual book would exist in thousands of individual libraries. It could always be recovered, regardless of what happens to the people who own the master copy, as it were.
Yeah, by forcing DRM upon users of different publishing platforms and different marketplaces, it tries to lead to lock-in for that particular platform. So it makes it much more difficult for somebody to be able to obtain books across different publishers or across different retailers, and just leads to a lot of cognitive overhead of being able to remember what you have and where you have it and manage your library across multiple different platforms. So I definitely agree that allowing the books to be able to be purchased legally and easily and being able to manage your library in the format and the location that you see fit would greatly increase the utility and popularity of ebooks in general.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And my wife actually runs a website called DRM Free, which lists books, a curated list of books that that are published without DRM. So and I have to set up that website. I try whenever I can to advocate for the DRM. The only purpose that DRM serves is to lock into walled gardens and vendor software. It doesn't actually protect against copyright infringement. So it's snake oil.
And so, in terms of the Calibre project, you have been building it in Python for a number of years, and I'm wondering if you were to start the project over today, do you think that you would make the same choice of language, or if there are any architectural or design decisions that you would do differently if you didn't have the weight of legacy behind the project?
So I definitely choose the same language. As for architecture and design, the overall architecture and design would also be pretty much similar. There are various warts, obviously, in a project of Calibre size and age that I would do differently if I could, but they're all relatively implementation-based things, not design-based things. I'm really pretty happy with the overall design of Calibre, and Python has served us really well, and I would totally choose it again if I were to start Calibre again today. So the biggest challenge as far as Python is concerned and Calibre is concerned is migrating to Python 3. So Calibre currently only works on Python 2. So that's a pretty large task that is proceeding slowly. I don't know if it will happen in time for the 2020 deprecation too. But if it doesn't, I actually maintain my own fork of Python 2. So I will continue to use that until such time as the migration.
And what are your plans for the future of Calibre?
Just keep doing what I've been doing. Add new features, the things. So Calibre is completely user driven. So new features are added by user demand. Add new features, polish things, add support for new devices as they release, new ebook formats as they are invented, that sort of thing. So Calibre is both fun to work on, and I think it serves a important and useful purpose for society at large. So pretty optimistic or pretty determined to keep doing what I've been doing as long as I can.
And are there any other aspects of the Calibre project or your experience of building and maintaining it and growing the community, or ebooks and ebook management in general, that we didn't discuss yet that you think we should cover before we close out the show?
So something, I guess, a bit of advice that I'd like to give fellow open source software developers is try to make it as easy as possible for non-technical users to use your software. I mean, assuming you're writing something that's aimed at a non-technical market. This means, having things like installers, having things like tutorials. Like one of the things I did early on at Calibre is make a video tutorial, tour of Calibre, and I've got lots and lots of positive feedback about that. So do go the extra mile to make things a little bit easier. The other thing is target. It's likely that you'll be working on Linux or Macs if you're working on open source software, but don't neglect Windows, because most of your users will still use Windows. Yeah, and the other thing is, don't be afraid of having bugs in your software. Users are fairly forgiving as long as you address their concerns and fix the bugs promptly. So yeah, I think that's what I'd like to say.
And so for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow the work that you're up to, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And with that, I'll move us into the picks. And this week, I'm going to choose the book American Gods by Neil Gaiman. It is a very interesting and well-written and engaging book, and it's a great piece of modern mythology. So I've read it a couple of times, and I thoroughly enjoy it. So I definitely recommend that to anybody who is looking for a good book to read. And with that, I'll pass it to you, Kovid. Do you have any picks for us this week?
Actually, can I get back to you on that? I actually do have a few picks, but I want to review the list before I finalize them. I didn't have time to finish this before. I'll send you an email with the list of my picks maybe by the end.
Absolutely. So I will add your picks to the show notes once you get those sent over. So for anybody who is interested in that, they can refer back to the show notes once the episode goes live. So with that, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me today and for your work on Calibre. It's a project that I have used on my own for quite a while now and have gained a lot of value from it. So I appreciate all your efforts, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to interview me, and it's been fun talking.